The marble walls of the Supreme Court chamber seemed to amplify every word as Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson's voice cut through the tension. Congresswoman Crockett, you will cease this line of questioning immediately, Justice Jackson said, her normally measured tone now firm with authority. Your disregard for this court's procedures cannot continue. The packed courtroom fell into stunned silence. Representative Jasmine Crockett, known for her fierce advocacy and legal brilliance, stood frozen at the podium, her case notes still open before her. Never in her distinguished career had she been ordered to stop her arguments by a justice she so deeply admired. Madam Justice, with all due respect, Crockett began. With all due respect, Congresswoman, Justice Jackson interrupted, you will gather your materials and leave this chamber. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning. As murmurs rippled through the historic chamber, the heavy wooden doors at the back swung open. A distinguished elderly gentleman in a perfectly pressed suit walked slowly down the center aisle, his presence commanding attention despite his age. The court-martial moved to intercept him, but stopped when Justice Jackson's expression changed to one of recognition. What happened next would not only transform the landmark civil rights case before the court, but would reveal a profound personal history connecting these powerful women that nobody in the room could have anticipated. Before we continue with this extraordinary true story of justice, respect, and unexpected connections, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel for more powerful stories about the intersection of law, justice, and humanity. 2 months earlier, Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had received the case that would define her career. As a former civil rights attorney now serving in Congress, she had been asked to represent the families of 5 Black community leaders whose historic church in rural Mississippi had been seized through an obscure property law dating back to the Reconstruction era. The Rainbow Baptist Church had stood for over 150 years, serving as both a spiritual center and a hub for civil rights organizing since the 1950s. But when valuable mineral deposits were discovered in the region, a development corporation had uncovered documents suggesting the church's land had never been properly transferred to the congregation after the Civil War. This case represents the continuing struggle against systemic property theft that has stripped generational wealth from Black communities for centuries, Crockett had explained at a press conference announcing her decision to represent the families. These tactics may have become more sophisticated over time, but they remain just as unjust. The case had moved with unusual speed through the appellate courts due to its constitutional implications, finally reaching the Supreme Court under circumstances that placed enormous pressure on everyone involved. The Development Corporation had already begun preliminary work, and without an injunction, the historic church would be demolished within weeks. Justice Ketanji Brown Jackson, the first Black woman to serve on the Supreme Court, had her own complicated connection to the EU case. Before her judicial career, she had written extensively about property law inequities affecting historically marginalized communities. Conservative commentators had already suggested she should recuse herself, claiming her academic work showed bias. Justice Jackson brings valuable expertise to this case, not bias, legal analyst Sophia Washington had explained on CNN. Her scholarly understanding of these complex legal histories is precisely why diverse perspectives on the court matter. What nobody knew, what nobody could have known, was that Justice Jackson and Congresswoman Crockett shared a deeper connection than their parallel paths as Black women in the legal profession. Jackson's father, Johnny Brown, had been a dedicated public school teacher and principal in Washington, D.C. for decades before her appointment to the Supreme Court. A man known for his dignity, intelligence, and unwavering moral compass, He had profoundly influenced his daughter's path to the nation's highest court. "My father taught me that justice isn't just a concept in books," Jackson had said during her confirmation hearings. "It's something you practice every day in how you treat others and stand up for what's right." What remained private was that decades earlier, as a young teacher in Mississippi, before moving to Washington, Johnny Brown had been deeply involved in the civil rights movement, including efforts to protect black churches that served as meeting places for organizers. "The historic significance of this case cannot be overstated," explained Professor James Williams of Howard University Law School. "It combines property rights, religious freedom, and the ongoing struggle for racial justice in America. And having Congresswoman Crockett argue it personally, rather than delegating to a Supreme Court specialist, sends a powerful message about her commitment." As the oral arguments approached, both women prepared for what would be a defining moment in their careers, neither aware that their paths had invisibly crossed decades before. The morning of oral arguments arrived with the Supreme Court Plaza filled with supporters of both sides. Inside, the historic chamber buzzed with anticipation as Jasmine Crockett approached the podium. Her red suit, a striking contrast against the dark wood and marble surroundings. "Mr. Chief Justice, and may it please the court," Crockett began with the traditional opening. "This case presents a question of fundamental fairness. Can century-old technical defects in property transfers be weaponized to seize land that has been occupied, maintained, and improved by a community for generations?" For the first 20 minutes, the oral arguments proceeded normally, with various justices interrupting with questions and hypotheticals. Crockett handled each with the skilled precision that had made her reputation as a formidable attorney long. Before her congressional career, Justice Clarence Thomas asked about adverse possession principles. Justice Elena Kagan probed the implications for other religious institutions. Justice Brett Kavanaugh questioned whether state or federal law should govern. Then Crockett turned to a line of argument that would dramatically change the tenor of the proceedings. "The historical context here cannot be ignored," she stated firmly. "After emancipation, freed slaves were promised land ownership as a path to true citizenship. Those promises were systematically broken through legal technicalities, violence, and fraud. This case represents a continuation of that injustice." She held up a document. "I submit to the court evidence that the Development Corporation specifically targeted historically black churches in this region, conducting detailed title searches on those properties while ignoring similarly situated white churches with equally complex historical title issues." Justice Samuel Alito leaned forward. "Counselor, are you suggesting the Development Corporation's actions were racially motivated? That's a serious accusation." "I'm not suggesting it, Justice Alito. I'm demonstrating it with evidence," Crockett replied, her voice unwavering. "Their internal communications, obtained during discovery, explicitly discuss finding vulnerabilities in black church titles as a strategy for land acquisition." A murmur ran through the courtroom as Crockett continued. "Furthermore, Rainbow Baptist Church's situation is not unique. We've identified a pattern across the South where these tactics—" "Counselor," Justice Jackson interrupted, her expression unreadable. "The specific allegations about the Development Corporation's targeting practices weren't included in your briefs. The court cannot consider new evidence at this stage." Crockett paused, then pressed forward. "With respect, Justice Jackson, the evidence of discriminatory intent isn't new. It's central to understanding why traditional property remedies are insufficient here. The church's congregation has maintained this property for over 150 years, including during periods when black land ownership was actively threatened by violence." She turned to a new page in her notes. "In fact, In 1967, when Rainbow Baptist Church faced a similar legal challenge, community leaders risked their safety to protect their deeds and documents. One of those leaders, a young teacher named Johnny Brown, transported the church's historical records to safety during a night of heightened tensions. At the mention of this name, Justice Jackson's expression changed almost imperceptibly. Only those watching closely would have noticed her slight forward movement, the narrowing of her eyes in focused attention. "Congresswoman Crockett," Jackson said, her voice measured. "The court is well aware of the historical context. However, you're introducing specific historical incidents that aren't in the record before us. Madam Justice, these incidents establish the continuous community stewardship that should override technical defects in the chain of title," Crockett countered. "Mr. Brown's actions that night—" "Counselor," Jackson interrupted more firmly this time, "you will confine your arguments to the legal issues and evidence properly before this court." Something in her tone made the chamber go completely still. The tension was palpable as Crockett stood her ground. "Justice Jackson, with all due respect, I cannot adequately represent my clients without addressing the historical pattern of using legal technicalities to divest black communities of their property. The story of Johnny Brown's courage that night is documented in contemporaneous accounts that—" "Congresswoman Crockett," Justice Jackson said, her voice now unmistakably stern, "you will cease this line of questioning immediately. Your disregard for this court's procedures cannot continue." The courtroom fell silent. Even the other justices seemed surprised by the exchange between these two trailblazing black women legal scholars. One now a Supreme Court justice, the other a congresswoman and civil rights attorney. "Madam Justice, with all due respect," Crockett began again. "With all due respect, Congresswoman," Justice Jackson interrupted, "you will gather your materials and leave this chamber. This court will reconvene tomorrow morning." The pronouncement sent shock waves through the room. Never in recent memory had an advocate been ordered to leave during oral arguments. Journalists scrambled to make sense of what was happening. As Yansiu, Crockett stood frozen in apparent disbelief. The heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom opened. An elderly man with silver hair and dignified bearing walked slowly down the center aisle. The court-martial moved to intercept him, but Justice Jackson raised her hand slightly, stopping him. Her expression had transformed from stern authority to something much more complex. The elderly gentleman continued his deliberate walk toward the front of the courtroom, his eyes moving between Representative Crockett and Justice Jackson. The Supreme Court's rigid protocols seemed temporarily suspended as Johnny Brown, now 87 years old, approached the bar that separates the public from the proceedings. His weathered hands gripped a worn leather satchel, the kind teachers once carried. Chief Justice Roberts leaned toward Justice Jackson with a questioning look. After a brief whispered exchange, he nodded and addressed the courtroom. "This court will take a 30-minute recess," he announced, bringing his gavel down with unusual gentleness. As the justices rose to exit through the curtains behind their bench, Justice Jackson hesitated, her eyes meeting Johnny Brown's in a moment of unspoken communication. She then followed her colleagues out of the chamber. Court security created a small private conference room where Congresswoman Crockett, Johnny Brown, and moments later, Justice Jackson met away from the public and press. What transpired in that room would not become public for several weeks, but when the court reconvened 30 minutes later, everything had changed. Chief Justice Roberts addressed the packed chamber. "Before we continue with oral arguments, Justice Jackson has requested a moment to address a matter of personal disclosure." Justice Jackson's normally composed judicial demeanor was infused with a new quality, a personal warmth rarely displayed. From the bench, "It has come to my attention that this case involves historical events with which I have a previously undisclosed personal connection," she began. My father, Johnny Brown, who is present in the courtroom today, was indeed the teacher referenced in Congresswoman Crockett's argument. Murmurs spread through the courtroom as journalists frantically took notes. While I was aware of my father's involvement in civil rights activities before our family moved to Washington, I had no knowledge of his specific connection to Rainbow Baptist Church until today. Under normal circumstances, this might require my recusal from this case. She paused, her gaze sweeping the chamber. However, given the advanced stage of these proceedings and the urgent nature of the injunctive relief sought, recusal would effectively result in a 4-4 deadlock that would maintain the status quo, allowing the immediate destruction of this historic site before a full legal resolution. Justice Jackson continued, "After consultation with the Chief Justice and Ethics Counsel during our recess, I have determined that the appropriate course is full disclosure rather than recusal. My father has agreed to provide a sworn affidavit regarding his knowledge of the Church's historical records, which will be properly entered into evidence for all parties to address." The Chief Justice nodded. "The court will accept supplemental briefing from both parties addressing this new information within 48 hours. Congresswoman Crockett, you may continue your argument, confined to the legal issues properly before the court." When Crockett returned to the podium, her approach had visibly shifted. Gone was the passionate advocate pushing boundaries. In her place stood a disciplined legal strategist. "Thank you, Mr. Chief Justice. As I was attempting to establish, the doctrine of equitable estoppel should prevent the Development Corporation from challenging title defects they discovered through targeted research when the church community has openly and continuously occupied this land for over 150 years. She proceeded with a masterful argument, weaving together property law, equity principles, and religious freedom protections without again straying into unsubmitted evidence. When the Development Corporation's attorney took his turn, he faced unexpectedly pointed questioning from several justices, including conservatives who typically favored strict property rights interpretations. Justice Kavanaugh asked, "If a community has continuously used property for religious purposes for over a century, maintaining and improving it without challenge, doesn't that create a reasonable expectation of ownership that the law should protect?" Justice Thomas, who rarely spoke during oral arguments, addressed a question to the Development Corporation's lawyer. "Counselor, would your client's position be different if we were discussing a 150-year-old predominantly white church with similar technical defects in their historical title?" As the day's arguments concluded, legal commentators outside the court struggled to predict the outcome, but all agreed on one thing: the unexpected personal connection between Justice Jackson and the case had transformed the court's approach. To the legal questions at hand, Johnny Brown, who had remained in the courtroom throughout the proceedings, watched with quiet dignity as his daughter administered justice and Congresswoman Crockett advocated for the community he had once helped. 3 weeks later, the Supreme Court issued its ruling in Rainbow Baptist Church versus Meridian Development Corporation. In a surprising 7-2 decision that crossed ideological lines, the court ruled in favor of the church, establishing a new precedent that would protect similarly situated historic community institutions across the country. Justice Jackson wrote the majority opinion, a masterpiece of legal reasoning that scholars would study for decades. She began with a powerful articulation of the principle at stake. Property rights, while fundamental to our legal system, do not exist in a historical vacuum. When technical defects in century-old transfers are weaponized to divest communities of lands they have continuously occupied, maintained, and improved for generations, especially when those communities were systematically denied equal access to legal protections, equity must intervene. The opinion established a new community stewardship doctrine that would protect long-standing religious and community institutions from title challenges based on historical technicalities when continuous use and maintenance could be demonstrated over multiple generations. Importantly, Justice Jackson directly addressed her personal connection to the case in a separate concurring opinion. My father's previously undisclosed connection to Rainbow Baptist Church initially presented an apparent ethical dilemma. However, it ultimately underscored a deeper truth about our legal system. The law does not exist separate from the lived experiences of the people it governs. The fact that a young teacher's actions to protect community documents in 1967 could remain relevant to a Supreme Court case in 2025 demonstrates why our courts must understand both legal principles and the historical contexts in which they operate. The Prudz Development Corporation issued a statement accepting the ruling and announcing they would pursue alternative sites for their project that don't require displacing historic community institutions. In the days following the decision, photographs of Johnny Brown sitting in the Supreme Court chamber while his daughter issued the ruling became iconic images, symbolic of the long arc of civil rights history and the personal journeys of Black Americans from disenfranchisement to the highest levels of legal authority. For Congresswoman Crockett, the case represented both a professional triumph and a personal awakening. At a community celebration at Rainbow Baptist Church, she addressed the congregation. "When I first took this case, I saw it as a legal battle against historical injustice. What I didn't understand was how deeply personal this history is, how individual acts of courage create ripples that continue for generations." She gestured to where Johnny Brown sat in the front pew. Mr. Brown's decision to protect this church's documents during a dangerous time created a historical record that ultimately saved this sacred place. And his daughter's journey from that community to the Supreme Court ensured that the full context of your struggle would be understood. The relationship between Justice Jackson and Congresswoman Crockett also evolved following the case. Initially tense during oral arguments, they developed a mutual respect that transcended their professional roles. In a joint interview months later, after the case was fully resolved, they reflected on their unusual courtroom confrontation. "Justice Jackson was absolutely right to hold me accountable to proper procedure," Crockett acknowledged. "No matter how just our cause, the rule of law requires that we advance justice through established processes. That discipline ultimately made our arguments stronger." Justice Jackson nodded. And Congresswoman Crockett was right that historical context matters deeply. The law isn't just about abstract principles. It's about how those principles protect real communities with real histories. Finding the balance between procedural integrity and substantive justice is the central challenge of our legal system. Chaudhry Brown, who had largely avoided public attention throughout his life, offered a rare interview to a documentary filmmaker capturing the story of Rainbow Baptist Church. "I never sought recognition for helping preserve those church records," he twice said quietly. "I was just a young teacher who understood that a community's documents are its voice through time. I couldn't have imagined that small act would echo through history to a Supreme Court case where my daughter sat in judgment and a congresswoman I'd never met would speak my name." He smiled gently. "But that's how justice works across generations. We each do what we can in our moment, and sometimes those moments connect in ways we could never predict." The Rainbow Baptist Church case established legal precedent that would protect dozens of similar historically Black churches and community institutions across the South. Legal scholars noted that the community stewardship doctrine represented a significant evolution in property law that acknowledged historical inequities while creating forward-looking protections. Perhaps most significantly, the case transformed The national conversation about the Supreme Court itself. The image of Justice Jackson's father sitting in the courtroom as she delivered justice for a community he had once helped, bridging generations of the civil rights struggle, reminded Americans that their highest court was increasingly reflecting the full diversity of American experience. For the congregation of Rainbow Baptist Church, the victory meant more than just keeping their building. As their pastor explained during the first Sunday service after the ruling, this church has always been more than wood and stone. It's the physical embodiment of our community's persistence through hardship, our faith through trials, and our determination to create spaces where justice and dignity prevail. Today, we thank God that our highest court recognized what we have always known, that our continuous stewardship of this sacred space has earned us the right to call it home. If you found this story of justice, generational connections, and the power of individual courage inspiring, please hit the like button and subscribe to our channel for more stories about the real people behind America's most important legal battles. Share your thoughts in the comments about how personal experiences should inform our legal system and how we balance procedural rules with substantive justice. Your engagement helps us bring you more content that matters.